Well, hello, everyone. Andrew Kercher here. Um, I'm so thankful to be back virtually here in Livonia. At Nate's request, I think he does an excellent job in picking out speakers for this series, I should say. But this is actually one of my favorite talks to give and things to share about. I'm a professional historian. I've worked at museums around the state. I'm currently the community engagement manager up in Port Huron Museums. But one of my big interests has always been political history. It's the day before Election Day. In case you have been living under a rock, haven't noticed, political ads or anything. The United States obviously has a rich history of democracy, and the president being one of those symbols of democracy, no matter who the president is. We always think of that, the leader of the free world and that sort of thing. But one of the things that always has struck me as interesting about presidents is that, when they are in office and, in the years immediately following their time in office, they are among the most famous people on earth. You would recognize, Joe Biden, you'd recognize Barack Obama, any of these people who have, held the office in the last, 30 years, any living current former president, you would recognize immediately. But there also gets to be a point where you could show a picture of somebody like Franklin Pierce or Millard Fillmore, and there are lots of people who say, I don't have any idea who that is. So it shows you, fame is fleeting, obscurity is forever. So I've always been interested in looking at some of these more obscure presidents that at one time were incredibly famous, and now the average man in the street might not know anything about them. So before we also dive in, we're going to be looking at a number of presidents, primarily from the 19th century. So we're not actually going to get to deal with any modern politics. I think almost every president from the 20th century is one that is not obscure, we know about. It's my completely arbitrary personal obscurity rating that I give these presidents to decide if they were included in the slideshow or not. So we're almost exclusively going to be talking about older presidents. And the other thing I like to make note is, while some of these presidents were in political parties that sound familiar today, like the Democrats or the Republicans, by and large, the Democratic Party of the 1850s, for instance, really has nothing to do with the Democratic Party today. It has a historic lineage, but their platforms are completely unrecognizable. In the early part of the 19th century, the Democrats actually tended to be the more conservative political party. So obviously, over hundreds of years, these parties' views change. So just keep that in the back of your mind, if we're talking about the Democratic Party or the Republicans when they show up on the scene in the 1850s. The Republicans of the 1880s aren't the Republicans of the 1950s, who aren't the Republicans of today. And same thing, like I said, with the Democrats. So it's a fun way to kind of examine U.S. history. And I think if more people knew, I've got kind of some stories, some anecdotes about some of these presidents. I think if people knew a little bit more about their personalities and what was going on when they were president, they might not be as obscure as they are today. So with that being said, we can dive in. So George Washington, right? We're not going to be talking about him. He is not an obscure president. He's like the platonic ideal of a president, right? Everybody knows him. He's on the $1 bill. He's on the quarter. Very recognizable. And if we know one thing about George Washington, if you ask any first graders, he'd probably tell you he's the first U.S. president. But was he? So remember, George Washington is inaugurated in 1788 with the Constitution having been ratified. But the United States, declares independence in 1776 and functionally has independence by 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. So that's the better part of a decade where they're operating under a different system of government where George Washington is not the president. But who was our first president then? You could argue, John Hancock was president of the Continental Congress when we actually signed the Declaration of Independence. But there are people like Peyton Randolph was president even before we signed the Declaration. But, if you're going to sign the Declaration, do you go back a little bit in time? There are people like Samuel Johnson, who was from North Carolina. He was elected the first president after they ratified the Articles of Confederation. And he just said, no, thanks. I would rather not. Kind of a weird thing to think of today. A president just saying, no, I'd rather not be. But the president was much different under the Articles of Confederation. You even got people like John Hanson, who becomes technically, the first president after all of the states had ratified the Articles of Confederation before the United States Constitution. And he wanted to quit after the first week. His job was basically as a moderator to Congress that had assembled. The legislative branch held basically all of the power. There was no real chief executive. So it's kind of things like this that we also have to think back on U.S. history and remember that the Constitution, the modern presidency, has been shaped significantly in the last 200 years. And we didn't even start out with the system that we have today. But I want to get into our presidents those are extremely obscure because it's questionable if they even count as presidents. This guy's definitely president and kind of starts our first obscure president. I think the first 10 or so presidents are largely pretty well known. Certainly the first, 5 or 6, they're all founding fathers. Everybody knows, John Adams. If you get a mini series from HBO where you're played by Paul Giamatti, you're not obscure. You get people like, Thomas Jefferson, Madison Monroe, all of these different original founding fathers, not obscure. But we get to this guy, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was Andrew Jackson's vice president. Andrew Jackson's another guy that I think we know pretty well. He's on the 20. Hopefully, you get to see him a lot in that way. Although how much longer he'll be on the 20, I don't know. Supposed to be replaced. I think Harriet Tubman's headed that way. But Martin Van Buren is not on any currency. Well, he's on presidential coins, but none of the currency we use regularly. And what I like to do for most of these presidents is also try and provide at least one quote, something so they can speak in their own words. It's easier to do a job right than to explain why you didn't. Pretty sound advice. Makes a lot of sense. So he was from a place called Old Kinderhook in New York, and he's actually the first president. He's the first president born in the United States, which is kind of neat. All those people think about George Washington. He of course can't be born in a country he helps found. But now there's this changing of the guard. He is president in the 1830s. So by the 1830s, we're well enough removed from the Declaration of Independence back in the 1770s that there's a completely new generation of leaders. He's also the only president to not speak English as his first language. He spoke Dutch. He was Kinderhook, New York. We think about the Dutch population. Van Buren sounds like he could be from the west side of the state, right? There's lots of Dutch over in Holland. But this is his wife, Hannah Van Buren, who died quite early at age 35 in 1819. So Martin Van Buren did not have a traditional first lady with him when he was in the office. There's his house, Lindenwald. And as I mentioned, he was the first president born in the United States. I also like to show off some of these presidential homes. I think when we think of the president, we always think of them living in Washington, D.C. And some presidents have come from a lot of money. They're very wealthy. We think about, the Kennedys did pretty well for themselves by the time, Kennedy's president, or, the Bushes who have, places up in Kennebunkport and these great big places. But in the 19th century, there were quite a few presidents who actually came from rather humble origins and beginnings, but pretty nice looking place there, Lindenwald. So when we look at his electoral college map, this is the election of 1836, where he is elected. So he's riding the coattails of Andrew Jackson into office. He had been the vice president, wants to be the president. Always a good way to set yourself up. I mean, our current president was a vice president. Shows you kind of know what's going on. You've got the experience necessary. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this map is how many different people are getting electoral votes. At this time, you have two political parties. You have basically the Democrats, which are the party of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. And then you have everyone else. You eventually get a party, the Whig Party. It's one of these old-timey political parties we hear of. And the Whigs basically coalesce around one single idea. They have all sorts of different ideas on the different issues of the day, but there's one they can all agree on, and it's that they don't like Andrew Jackson. He's a polarizing political figure. So what the Whigs do is they actually run different candidates in different parts of the country. It's not a national campaign like we know today. In fact, these political campaigns take place over the course of a few different weeks. It's not all on just one day. And in different parts of the country, they run different people who are popular for different reasons. And they figure if they can split the vote enough, that Congress will be forced to pick a winner. And they feel like they've got pretty good odds in Congress to get a Whig elected, but it doesn't work out for him. Martin Van Buren is still able to carry the day, beats people like Daniel Webster, William Henry Harrison, who will be back in 1840. So some of the issues, that's one of the other reasons I think about why are some of these presidents obscure? And I think one of the big things that goes into it is the issues that they dealt with are not issues that we deal with today. There are a lot of issues that would have been hotly contested in the 19th century. So today, if you ask anyone who is involved in politics, if they have an opinion on, say, inflation or an opinion, they're probably all going to say it's bad, right? Let's take something like abortion, like whether you're for it, you're against it, regulate it, not regulate it. Everyone has an opinion. These are things that come up as, very hot topic in politics right now, for sure. But the topics that they're discussing in the 19th century, a lot of them have either become completely moot or they're so far removed from what we think of today. How many of us have a strong opinion on a national bank? This is something in the 1830s, many people would have had a very strong opinion if they were for the national bank or the second national bank, because Andrew Jackson kills the first national bank and this centralized monetary policy. It's just not something we think about today, but in the 1830s, that was the hot button issue. So we see again, there's a King Andrew the First. People didn't like Andrew Jackson. He was using the veto. He treated himself kind of like a king. And Martin Van Buren was riding his coattails. There's a picture of that second bank of the United States. There were things like the Amistad case. Amistad was a slave ship that the enslaved people on board had actually overthrown their Spanish captors and wound up drifting into port and wound up being into a free state. They had to go to the Supreme Court to decide what is going to be the fate of these formerly enslaved Africans. They were eventually freed. So these are kind of the issues. And slavery, I mentioned that also because that's going to be one of the defining topics of the first half of the 19th century. All of these presidents, these first ones we talk about, that kind of becomes the stick out issue for them in many different ways. There are other things. This guy, Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, if you're familiar with Mormon history and all, I like this quote from Joseph Smith. He says, "He was not fit as my dog for the chair of state, for my dog will make an effort to protect his abused and insulted master, while the present chief magistrate will not so much as lift a finger to relieve an oppressed and persecuted community of freemen." So this is another thing that's going on in the 1830s and early 1840s. You've got the formation, you've got basically the Second Great Awakening going on, the formation of groups like the Mormon Church, who are kind of being forced to flee from state to state as state governors don't like them very much. And they wind up being this kind of persecuted minority. Joseph Smith goes to Washington, where he writes letters to Washington. He wants to meet with Martin Van Buren, who was the president at the time, to plead his case. And Martin Van Buren just didn't want to have much to do with him at all. So not very kind words from Joseph Smith. I also include Joseph Smith because sprinkled throughout my presentation, I have just little bits of some presidential trivia and information that anybody who's come to this wants to learn about the presidents. These are things that would interest you. So here we have a slide of the assassination of Joseph Smith, his brother Hiram, from unseen assailants, sticking gun barrels through. Joseph Smith was actually in the Carthage jail at the time. This could be its own whole presentation. It's certainly interesting history. But when he was assassinated in 1844, Joseph Smith had already decided he was running for president. So this makes him actually the very first presidential candidate to ever be assassinated. So this is before, obviously, the presidents were. And when he was killed, as I mentioned, in 1844, first presidential candidate to be assassinated. Being president is a very, very dangerous job, as we'll find out if you simply look at the numbers game. If 4 out of 46 men who have held the job have been murdered while holding the job, not to mention all the ones who have died in office from all of the extra stress, things like that. It's a pretty high attrition rate for being president of the United States. Martin Van Buren runs into a lot of trouble during his office, during his years in office. There's the campaign of 1840. This is one of my favorite pieces of political ephemera. This is a little pull tab card. You pull the little tab, his eyes roll up in his head because he has a beautiful goblet of White House champagne, and then you pull the thing down and he has an ugly mug of log cabin hard cider. This was one of these first cases where they were trying to make him look like not a man of the people. He's too rich to know a common man's problems, like William Henry Harrison, which was ironic because William Henry Harrison was pretty wealthy himself. And that brings us to 1840. William Henry Harrison winds up winning this election quite handily. You have the Panic of 1837. We'll actually talk about that a little bit later on. But when you have hard economic times, heck, ask the president, ask any Democrat you know right now, and they will tell you that when you have hard economic times, the threat of a recession, it's going to be really hard to get reelected. And that's basically what ruins Martin Van Buren's chance to come back into office. So they elect William Henry Harrison, who runs this very much a populist campaign. He's a man of the people. You've heard his campaign slogan. He is one of the most successful ones in the entire history of running for office. It's Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So this is William Henry Harrison. You can see him in the upper left there. He was a War of 1812 hero. Being a war hero always helps. His wife, Anna, has quite a few different kids there. He also has success at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is actually before the War of 1812, fighting with indigenous peoples in Ohio and Indiana. He spent a long time as the territorial governor of Indiana. In fact, there's his house, Grouseland. This is if it looks like a very Southern style plantation home, that's the effect he wanted to go for. In fact, he's not necessarily the most sympathetic character because he was known as an Indian fighter, and he was also known as somebody who was very disappointed that Indiana was not opened up to slavery. They thought that Indiana should be ripe for plantation style economy, but the territory, of course, slavery was illegal and it stayed that way. But it didn't mean that he didn't try and change some of those rules and laws. But there's very little to say about his office. If he is famous for one thing, it's that he was president for 30 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes. He died almost just a little over 1 month into his tenure as chief of state. He was the oldest man at the time who'd ever been elected president. He was 68. People said, "Oh, you're too old. You're not going to be fit for office." So he actually gave a 3.5-hour speech in the driving rain at his inauguration in March of 1841. There's not a whole lot of consensus that it was necessarily that speech. Some people have often said that it was pneumonia that killed him, but he also said that it was just as likely cholera or some of the other diseases from the poor water at the White House, which we'll see might have claimed the life of more than one president. So his quote, "The only legitimate right to govern is the express grant of power from the governed." Sure, okay, that makes sense. So then we have John Tyler. Again, we get a bunch of these obscure presidents right in a row. John Tyler was his vice president. If the tide of defamation and abuse shall turn, my administration come to be praised, future vice presidents who may succeed to the presidency may feel some slight encouragement to pursue an independent course. Well, good on you. I think if there's going to have one group of people who like John Tyler, it's future vice presidents who become presidents. Because when he becomes president, he's the first vice president to step in the role. And there's quite a bit of question of whether or not he was actually the president. I know that seems like a weird thing to ask, but the question was, well, is he the president or is he the acting president? Does he have to do the things the old president would have wanted to do, or can he pursue an independent course? Is he allowed to change cabinet members, for instance, if the president and vice president had disagreed on something? But John Tyler stepped in. There were lots of letters that were addressed to him that simply said, to the acting president Tyler, and he threw them away. He said, return to sender. He said, "I'm not acting president. I really am the president now," and really set a precedent for how that was going to be with future presidents. So he was married twice. He was very busy. He had more children than any other president, 10 kids. Julia Gardner Tyler, his second wife, bore him a son named Lyon, and when he was well into his 70s. And Lyon Tyler actually had a son in his 80s. So we have Lyon Tyler Jr., who died just 2 years ago, who was John Tyler's grandson. And what's even more amazing than that is Harrison Tyler is still alive. There's actually a living grandchild of the 10th president of the United States, John Tyler, was president in the 1840s. So it's pretty wild, and it actually does a pretty good job of summing up just how short American history really is. It's just a few human lifetimes and gets us right to present. So pretty wild to think about that. So here we can see, John Tyler, Julia Gardner, Lyon Gardner Tyler, and then Lyon Tyler Jr. and Harrison, who is still alive. So here's John John Tyler receiving the news of President Harrison's death. So you can see he is ecstatic there, I guess would be the word. He kind of sits motionless as this man brings him the news. The one other story we have, because again, I like to tell some of these stories. I think it brings these presidents a little bit more to life. And this is a wild story that I think very few, even students of American history, would be familiar with. This is the steamer Princeton in the 1850s. This was a steamship that still had the sailing vessels. This was part of the U.S. Navy. It had, of course, cannons on it, as any ship did. This is the Stockton gun. This is actually one of the cannons, one exactly like the cannon that was on the Princeton. And when this ship was commissioned in the 1840s, as they finished it, they actually went out, as you can see here, actually not a super happy ending to this story. They were taking the ship out and cruising around the Potomac with the president, his cabinet were all on board. And they were on this kind of sail in the summer. Well, they were firing one of the big guns, firing salute charges, had fired a 200-pound ball with 45 pounds of gunpowder. This gun was named the Peacemaker. Well, when they fired the gun, it exploded. One of the interesting things, this is actually a Currier and Ives print. You know, in the Christmas songs where they're always talking about prints by Currier and Ives. I don't think they're ever talking about this one. I think they talk more about the Christmas ones, but the pleasant Christmas scenes, not these people jumping away from an exploding gun. But this was an incredible explosion, and it's very lucky that John Tyler was actually on the other side of the ship. He was not injured because people like Abel Upshur, the Secretary of State, Thomas Gilmer, the Secretary of the Navy, the captain, Beverly Kennan, was killed. The president's valet, enslaved man named Armistead, and David Gardner was actually the father-in-law of his second wife. So his first wife actually dies when he's office, and then he marries that Julia Gardner a little bit later on, after he retires from the presidency. And Virgil Maxey, who was a prominent attorney in Maryland, are all killed, but 20 other people are injured. And it's, again, very lucky that John Tyler was not killed in this explosion. It's amazing to think of what the news coverage would be today if the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Navy, are both killed. You've got cabinet officers killed, the president nearly killed. We almost had President Willie Magnum, who was the Speaker pro tem of the Senate, because when John Tyler became president, no one replaced him as vice president. There was no vice president. There wasn't a provision for that, and they didn't start replacing vice presidents until much later into the 20th century. So a real historical what if. During his time in office, this is when we have Texas seceding from Mexico, becoming an independent state. They settle the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, the boundary with Maine. They signed peace treaties with China. So those are kind of things going on in the 1840s. And John Tyler actually has the distinction of being the only president who's not buried underneath the American flag. John Tyler, when he left office, moved back to Virginia. And while he was in Virginia, the Civil War starts. He's quite a bit older, but he actually winds up siding with the Confederacy, and he's actually elected to Confederate Congress. So he's not just kind of content or just going along with it. He's actively supporting the Confederacy, and he winds up dying in 1862 during the Civil War. And as a result, he's buried with full Confederate military honors. So the only president to ever directly turn traitor on the country, and never got the chance to redeem himself, died during the war. So James K. Polk comes after him. I don't think he's necessarily an obscure president. He does an excellent job. He wins the Mexican War, accomplishes everything he wants in one term. But then we wind up with David Rice Atchison. You might think, I don't remember him. Well, he's president for only a single day, because after James K. Polk's term in office, we get Zachary Taylor, hero of the Mexican War that James K. Polk was winning. Well, Zachary Taylor was a kind of a religious man himself and refused to be sworn in on a Sunday. Well, the former president's term of office very clearly ends at noon on March the 4th. This is before we moved when Inauguration Day is. And since his term ended and the new president had not sworn an oath of office, it technically fell down to the President pro tem of the Senate, who was this David Rice Atchison, who was president for basically about 24 hours in 1851. Never judge a stranger by his clothes. Good words to live by, Zach Taylor. So Zach Taylor is an interesting guy because he is just a soldier. Here he is, old rough and ready. They give him the name, the Battle of Palo Alto. In fact, before he was elected president, he never voted. He didn't express really any political opinions. During the political campaign, actually, people asked him, people didn't even know what political party he was. He ran as a Whig and won, one of just a couple of Whigs to ever hold the office of president. And very ironically, during his campaign, this is a far cry from campaigns today, they asked him his political opinions on something, and he just said no comment. Kind of, wouldn't that be nice? I mean, in some ways, right? For obviously, if there's one person you want to share their political opinion with you, it's people running for office, but he just didn't feel like sharing those things with people. But he's a big war hero, and he wins a political office. So he's from Kentucky, Springfield. That's the name of his house there in Louisville. His wife, Peggy Smith Taylor. He is also only in office for just a few months. They start things like the Washington Monument is started under his tenure, but you can see there's his mausoleum, so it doesn't end well for him. He's actually out on the 4th of July of 1851. He celebrates with a cold bowl of milk and cherries, and then he gets incredibly sick and dies. Again, it's unclear if it's necessarily, poisoned cherries or anything like that. They went so far as to try and exhume him to test for poison because it seemed so unexpected. It was probably contaminated water at the White House itself. They just didn't have clean water back then. And that's how we wind up with Millard Fillmore, Millard Fillmore, boy, if he's not famous for anything other than being obscure, like the most obscure, that's what we know him for. So he becomes president because he was vice president, steps into that role so he could thank Zach Taylor, probably could thank him personally. They were alive at the same time. He said, "May God save the country, for it's evident its people will not. God knows I detest slavery, but it is an existing evil for which we are not responsible, and we have to endure it and give it such protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution till we can get rid of it without destroying the last hope of free government in the world." So he sends the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, largely considered one of the worst laws in the history of the United States, allowing slave catchers to come into northern states, re-kidnap formerly enslaved people, or just enslaved people who were never necessarily enslaved. But, what do you think paperwork is like in the 1850s to prove that you weren't someone's slave? So he has a very modest home there. His wife, Abigail Fillmore, who stayed with him until actually died while he was in office. He's one of these presidents who did a lot more after his term in office than during. He was friends with Dorothea Dix, who was, a major proponent of the Sanitary Commission during the Civil War and reforming the way nursing would work. He was president of the State University of New York at Buffalo for a long time. So how would you like, your dean of students to be Millard Fillmore? And as I mentioned, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed during his tenure. Slavery is kind of the defining issue by the 1850s. Everyone's talking about it in the country, and they're constantly looking for solutions to the problem. They can't find a way out. He does complete the continental United States in terms of our territory with the Gadsden Purchase. So buying this little tiny piece of Arizona and New Mexico from old Mexico, original Mexico, bringing of that shape. And he also is the man who sends Matthew Perry to Japan. Of course, not this Matthew Perry, but this Matthew Perry. There's a drawing of him from Japan. This is opportunity this is just one of my favorite things. I had to shoehorn it in here because it is just one of my favorite things in history. It might be one of yours. If you're a fan of history, you'll like this. We know that, Matthew Perry was sent by the United States in 1854, went to Japan, sailed into Tokyo Bay. Here's a drawing from the Japanese perspective. Interesting way to start trade negotiations by, firing the guns and saying, like, we will shoot at you if you don't trade with us, and forcing Japan open after hundreds of years of isolation from the rest of the world. So those trade goods started flowing back to the rest of the world. They were very much wanted. The United States got a great jump on that trade. Again, more Japanese drawings of this world event, some of these visitors from the United States sent by the president. Interesting to see it from that perspective. In the immediate years after Japan was opened, there was a huge demand for U.S. and world history. These people had been isolated. They wanted to know about the rest of the world. Imagine, aliens landed on Earth tomorrow. You'd probably want to see, hey, do you have a history book of your planet? I really want to read that. I know I would. That would be so exciting for me to get all of that new history basically dropped off at once. And this is one of my favorite works about U.S. political history. This is a Japanese history of the United States from 1860. And you'd probably be forgiven if you didn't recognize it here, but this is of course George Washington with a bow and arrow and being guided by the spirit of America to fight the British. And this is George Washington defending his wife Carol from a British official. George Washington's wife was named Martha, but they got some details wrong. And boy, that's pretty cool. Looks like he's got a sword. He's got a musket. There's a lot more samurai in American history than I remember, but you got to draw what you see. Benjamin Franklin here. That's Benjamin Franklin firing a cannon with his bare hands, directed by John Adams. Not an incident I remember from the Revolution, but again, it makes for a very compelling and fun story from a Japanese perspective. And there's even more than that, but again, had to shoehorn that in. There's all these great, there's ones of like Thomas Jefferson punching a tiger. What a great history of the United States, if not entirely accurate, certainly exciting. So Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce, as I mentioned, slavery is kind of the defining issue of the 1850s. Franklin Pierce looks like he could maybe be the savior of the country because he's a Democrat, which had largely been associated with the South, but he's from the North, he's from New Hampshire. Maybe he can find a compromise. And well, we can see by his quotes, "You've summoned me in my weakness, you must sustain me by your strength. There's nothing left to do but get drunk. Frequently, the more trifling the subject, the more animated and protracted the discussion." I feel you on that last one for sure, Franklin. But Franklin Pierce was, as I mentioned, a great candidate. He's from New Hampshire, Northern Democrat. Robert Pierce, his son, had died during the campaign of childhood illness. They had four boys, and 3 of them had died by the time of the campaign. So his wife, Jane, was having a very difficult time, as anyone would. Child mortality is something that we are blessed to not have quite as bad as they did in the 19th century. So they only had one son left. That's Benjamin there on the right. And when they were on their way to office, they had won the presidency. He was on his way from Boston down to Washington, D.C. by train. A train derailed. They were in a train accident. Franklin and Jane were fine. However, Benjamin was essentially decapitated in front of them in this train accident and killed in this very violent manner. And it broke both of them. Jane, if it happened today, would probably wind up being institutionalized in some way. She never really recovered, had a severe mental break. And Franklin Pierce also, that's what he was talking about when he said, "You sustain me in my moment of weakness, and there's nothing left to do but get drunk." He suffered massive depression, as anyone would when all 4 of your children die and one of them violently in front of you. And he was really in no state to be president. It's kind of amazing that he didn't resign because he just couldn't do it. There's a picture of his inauguration. He's there by himself in the middle. And when he was being inaugurated there, he was actually the first president to give an inauguration speech by memory. So there's a little something. Good on you, Franklin, for keeping that all up here in your noggin rather than on paper. So his vice president was a guy named William Rufus King. William Rufus King was from Alabama and was unavailable to come to the president's aid. You'd think that if ever had time to have a good vice president, it's when the president's in trouble. Well, William King was very sick. He had tuberculosis of some kind. He was coughing, very phlegmatic, and doctors advised him to go to Cuba to try and get better. And when he was in Cuba, he didn't get any better. He had been informed, "Hey, you won. You're the vice president. You have to get sworn in." It's like, "I'm in no position to come back to the United States or travel right now." So they actually passed an act of Congress that allowed him to be sworn in by a consular general to Cuba, which belonged to Spain at the time. So there wasn't even the true ambassador there. The consular general in Cuba swore him in. He's the first and only president or vice president to ever be sworn in not on U.S. soil. And he basically didn't get better. A week later, he said, "I want to die at home," and then went home and died 48 hours later in Alabama. He was vice president for less than a month. And so, boom, Franklin Pierce now doesn't have a vice president. And there's this great quote. It says, "I am now solitary and alone, having no companion in the house with me. I've gone a-wooing to several gentlemen, but have not succeeded with any one of them. I feel it's not good for a man to be alone, and I should be astonished to find myself married to an old maid who can nurse me when I am sick, provide good dinners for me when I am well, and not expect me any ardent or romantic affection." That's kind of a weird quote, and it actually comes from somebody you might recognize, James Buchanan, who was another president. James Buchanan lived with William DeRufus King. It's kind of, if you've ever seen that internet meme saying like, oh, history will say they're roommates. That is what history said for a long time, though seems to be a lot of indication, if you read between the lines, that they were probably involved in a romantic relationship with each other. They slept together in the same bed. They lived with each other for years. We know there were gay people in the 1850s, even if they're not using the modern terminology. So there's a very good chance that William King and a lot of their personal letters were actually destroyed by their families, were never released. So we can't really read into those. We can only read with what the information we have, but not boding well for Franklin Pierce's administration. His vice president is already dead a month in, and things are starting to boil over with slavery, the Brooks-Sumner affair. Preston Brooks, a representative from South Carolina, takes offense at some of the things that this Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, he's a senator, what he has to say about the South and slavery. He says this about another pro-slavery senator. Sumner says he touches nothing which he does not disfigure with error, sometimes of principle, sometimes of fact. He cannot open his mouth, but there flies a blunder. Kind of a mean thing to say. And Preston Brooks took such offense to it, and we all know it was actually a kind of a fight over slavery, that one day in the House of Representatives chamber, or excuse me, in the Senate chamber, he began beating Sumner, an older man, with his walking stick, and had another, basically, Southern representatives keep everyone back at bay while this beating commenced. So they're physically fighting in the middle of the Senate chamber. Sumner was almost killed by this. In fact, he suffered a traumatic brain injury. He had to go home and recuperate for 3 years before he could return to his job as a senator. He was reelected while he was at home with traumatic brain injury because the people felt so strongly about him and his feelings. Kansas, Nebraska, we can see these are two territories in 1850. They passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act because one of their proposed solutions for how to figure out how to deal with this slavery issue is just let the people who live there vote on it and decide. They figured maybe that'll be an easy way to decide. It's not. That's a terrible decision because it turns out that tons of pro-slavery, tons of anti-slavery people began moving into the area and just openly killing each other. There were a number of different massacres, fights, one involving this guy, John Brown. If you're a student of history, you've heard of him. At Pottawatomie Creek, he winds up, he and 6 others kill several pro-slavery settlers with broadswords. So there's just open fighting. Never a good sign for your president to have open warfare in one of your territories. So Franklin Pierce, when his term's up, he again has been heavily drinking. He's just done. He's gone. And then we're left with James Buchanan, who has become president. James Buchanan, who said, "I am the last president of the United States." And he said to Abraham Lincoln, "Sir, if you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you are indeed a happy man." Or a happy man indeed. So he this is Wheatland, that's his house in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania. Another picture of Rufus King that everyone knew the two of them lived together. President Buchanan was the only lifelong bachelor. He never had a wife. So again, take that for what it's worth. 2 lifelong confirmed bachelors who lived with each other for years. I don't know how else he would describe that relationship. So something that's not necessarily new in United States history. There's a picture of Buchanan. He's there with the great big white bow tie next to James K. Polk. He had been the Secretary of State under him a little bit earlier. And while he is president, nothing goes well. Again, the country is moving closer and closer to civil war. There's the Panic of 1857. So it's been 20 years since Martin Van Buren had the economy collapse. Now it collapses again. You've got the Dred Scott decision, the worst Supreme Court decision of all time, that said that Black people weren't considered people. They weren't citizens. They had 0 rights whatsoever. And Buchanan had actually written the Supreme Court and said, maybe you could make a broad decision rather than a specific one, and that'll settle things. And the broad decision they got was that Black people are not entitled to rights in any part of the United States. And finally, when he was leaving office or getting ready to leave, the election of 1860 takes place in November. Well, as we're probably all painfully aware, a lot can happen between an election and the inauguration, especially when the inauguration is all the way in March, as it was back then. That is when the South actually secedes. President Lincoln is elected. When he wins the election, states begin leaving the United States, like South Carolina is the first to declare, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And James Buchanan doesn't do anything. He doesn't send soldiers. He doesn't start negotiating. He doesn't move arms around so they can't be captured. He basically just shrugs up. There's a great South Carolina's ultimatum, great political cartoon from the era that sums it up, that Mr. President, if you surrender, I'll be, I have to fire. And the president just surrenders when, again, the South that was the time to attack them when they were going one by one. Not necessarily attack them, but deal with the problem in some way. The worst thing he could have done is what he did, which was absolutely nothing. Then we have, of course, the Civil War. We get Abraham Lincoln, not an obscure president, probably the most famous president, maybe him and George Washington. Everybody knows him, right? Then Andrew Johnson, we get President Grant, and then we get into this second set of obscure presidents that come right together in the second half of the 19th century. Again, these men are obscure for a number of reasons. Many of them are single-term presidents. The issues that they deal with in the 1870s, the 1880s, and 90s are not issues we deal with today. Rather than slavery, a lot of the questions center around things like tariffs or solid money. Should we have a silver standard or a gold standard or bimetallism? Again, questions we just don't really, no one has an opinion on today. They've become moot. Rutherford B. Hayes is elected in 1876, a very controversial election where there are a couple of set of election returns turned in. It's unclear if it should be Hayes or Tilden. Hayes, who is a Republican, he's elected with the condition that he basically has to promise to end radical Reconstruction in the South, and we'll talk about that. My policy is trust peace and to put aside the bayonet. I do not think it is wise policy to decide contested elections in the states by the use of the National Army. So there's him and his wife, Lucy. She was known as Lemonade Lucy. Their presidential site is in Fremont, Ohio, which is right by Toledo, so very close. If anybody wants a good presidential site to visit, that's going to be one of the closest ones outside of Grand Rapids. You could go see his presidential home. Lucy and Hayes were teetotalers. She was called Lemonade Lucy. They served no alcohol at the White House, which is a far cry from presidents like President Grant, who is a well-known heavy drinker. They were huge fans of new technology. They loved things like the telephone they had installed. In fact, Rutherford Hayes had a phone installed at his house. Interestingly, his phone number, which is listed, is 35. Kind of funny to think about someone having only a double-digit phone number, but that's how early of a phone adapter that he was. Here's a picture of him. I think, man, what a handsome president. He is just a handsome guy. I mean, he grows the great big whiskers and beard, but back in the 1850s, before he grows that beard, he's just a real handsome man. See why he's popular. So this is that Tilden Hayes election. Again, doesn't look like a modern political map. There's not, the solid South. You've got Louisiana and South Carolina voting different than Georgia or Virginia. Doesn't look like our modern brand of politics. And Tilden, who was the Democrat, who was going to be the first Democrat elected since the Civil War, just isn't able to eke it out. Things have to be settled after weeks and weeks and recounts, and something we all lived through back in like 2000. Think about that uncertainty like we had back then. And so finally, when they do settle things, he becomes president, but it ends radical reconstruction. So troops are pulled out of the South, which had still been occupied since the Civil War. Blacks had been allowed to vote, fully participate. There were Black congressmen, senators, representatives, state legislatures, but they had really only been guaranteed that right by vote at the point of the Northern Bayonet, the Union Army occupying the area, because when they leave, that's when the Jim Crow's laws start. So a lot of people see that end of radical Reconstruction as a real loss for the country. We were also celebrating our country's centennial in 1876, 100 years of being a country, always very exciting. They get some bad news during that centennial, because here's a picture of the Battle of the Greasy Grass, which we might know better today as the Little Bighorn. When this news arrives, it kind of puts a bit of a pall over the entire proceedings. Hayes is also interesting because of something he does not with the United States at all. While he's president, there's also a huge war, the largest war in the history of South America. South American history just isn't studied a ton, but this is a war where there's a guy named Francisco Lopez. That's him down there in the right with the beard in what looks like a Civil War uniform. He's the president of Paraguay, and Paraguay decides to get into a war with Brazil, Bolivia, and Argentina. So not necessarily the best idea. You don't have to be a military genius to look at the situation on the map and see that, like, oh, you're a very small country, and then you wind up declaring war on every country that surrounds you. Didn't work out very well. In fact, Paraguay almost ceased to exist. A little over 65 to about 75% of the country was killed in this war, either through starving to death or direct military casualties, disease. Paraguay never really recovered from this war. The war looks a lot like the Civil War, but again, taking place just a few years after in South America. Huge conflict for the area. Here's a picture of Francisco Lopez. You can tell he designed the uniform himself. I don't know if you could tell if he thinks what he thinks of himself, but he really thought of himself as the real, Napoleon of South America there, real fancy uniform. And he actually is a lot like Saddam Hussein. He winds up being hunted down in the jungle and being like shot to death because he fights on to the last minute and expected the entire country to die with him. And he said, if I'm going down, the whole country will as well. And that almost was the case. And the country was almost basically dissolved, but President Hayes stepped in and said, hey, can I help to offer some peace treaty negotiations? He stepped in, was able to retain some semblance of Paraguayan independence. The country stuck around. And in fact, this little department here in red, so it's kind of like a state in Paraguay, is named for Presidente Hayes. And that's the name of the state. So that's how much he was liked in Paraguay, that he was able to step in, end this gruesome, horrific war, negotiate peace between the four powers, that he is a well-respected in Paraguay, if not in the United States. Chester Arthur, another one of these kind of almost forgettable presidents. Madam, I may be president of the United States, but my private life is nobody's damn business. So Chester Arthur becomes president when James Garfield is assassinated in 1881. James Garfield is shot in the lower back by a guy named Charles Guiteau, who was obviously unstable, shot a president, but he had wanted to become the ambassador to France and thought he was deserved the position. They worked on a spoilage system where everyone got the spoils of victory. If your friend became president, you could be, named an ambassador. If you were a big donor to their campaign, I'm sure nothing like that happens anymore, but this was a huge problem in the 19th century. So after he dies, they actually enact the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which says that you have to be qualified to have your job. If you want to be the mailman, you have to prove you'd actually be good at being the mailman. But Chester Arthur was a very fashionable guy. You can see there's his house with a beautiful, nice swimming pool and beautiful coat there. Always dressed to the nine, probably the most fashionable president we had. In fact, he owned 70 pairs of trousers. That's a lot of pants, if you think about it. Besides passing the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which is generally considered quite a good piece of legislation, they also passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which literally just said you're not allowed to move to the United States if you're Chinese. It was incredibly racist. And there's not much else to say about it other than that. Not a great piece of legislation that he signed. And that's about it. He is done and out. I should mention the one other thing that's kind of interesting about him. While he is president, he actually holds a yard sale at the White House. There were tons of pieces left over from previous presidents and administrations. As a result, Chester Arthur thinks the place is cluttered, wants to get it out. And he has a yard sale. He's selling things like, oh, yeah, here's an old desk. I think this belonged to Thomas Jefferson. Who'll give me $10 for it? Because it's kind of unclear who owned that stuff. Today, of course, the White House is managed by the federal government as a whole and not by just the occupant who lives there. Excuse me. All right, so Grover Cleveland. He mocks the people who proposes that the government shall perfect the rich and that they shall in turn will care for the laboring poor. Grover Cleveland is the first Democrat to be elected after the Civil War. So he is an interesting guy, has an interesting personal life, that's for sure. This is Fransom Folsom, who is actually a business partner of Cleveland, dies, leaving his daughter orphan. Grover Cleveland raises her from about the age of 5. and then marries her when she turns 21. He's the only president to have ever been married while he was president in the White House. They have a wedding. Real weird today. No one says anything about it in the 1880s. It's not considered that abnormal or odd that he had kind of groomed this girl that he raised and then married. So our youngest first lady, just 21 years old. He was born at the Caldwell Presbyterian Parsonage there in New Jersey. Picture of him in his younger days. He's actually also one of the few presidents we know for a fact killed some people when he was actually running a jail in New York. There were a couple men sentenced to be executed, and Cleveland had been told, here's $100. You can go hire an executioner. And he said, oh, well, can I do it? I'll keep the money. And they said, well, yeah, you could keep the money and do it, but normally people don't want to do this. He said, oh, it's fine by me. And so he actually served as an executioner, hanged some men earlier in his career. He has what's quite possibly one of the largest scandals in the history of the presidency. He has a child out of wedlock with a woman and admits it later on before he was married to that 21-year-old he helped raise. He winds up impregnating Maria Halpin. She kind of actually suggests that it may not have even been consensual, which is another kind of turn to this story. When she approaches him saying that she's pregnant, a few weeks later, she claims anyway, Grover Cleveland eventually does kind of admit the parentage, and then you kind of have to wonder if the rest of the story is true, that when Halpin is pregnant, that she is liquored up and then dropped off at an insane asylum in Buffalo, New York. And when the drink kind of wears off, they realize she's not a crazy person. The kid was actually adopted by a doctor at the asylum and lives until 1947. Dr. J.E. King was really the illegitimate son of Grover Cleveland. That he admitted the slogan was always, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" And Democrats responded with, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." So this kind of puts things like, Stormy Daniels to shame, right? In terms of political scandals, to have just admitted children out of wedlock, and possibly even worse. While he was president, again, some of the issues of the day are, should they have free silver or not? Tariff reform, these things just are kind of boring, frankly. They're high-level economics that a lot of average people didn't care about, even then, especially not today. Here's the silver dog with the golden tail. A lot of the states in the West wanted silver to be recognized as regular currency so that you could pay your taxes in silver, but then other countries expected debts to be paid in gold, so it would quickly drain the U.S. gold reserves. So after 4 years in office, he runs against Benjamin Harrison, who's the grandson of William Henry Harrison. Pity the man who wants a coat so cheap that a man or woman who produces the cloth will starve in the process. Harrison is able to win. This is Harrison's house in Indianapolis, only president from Indiana. His first wife, Carolyn Harrison, lives until 1892. When she dies, he actually winds up marrying, we'll talk about that in just a second. He was a general during the Civil War. He was very proud of that fact. I was actually recently at his house. There's his home gym of the 1880s, so that's kind of cool. Some wooden barbells and little pulley cords. You can see it worked wonders. He was not necessarily the paragon of health, kind of a bit of a squat guy. But his second wife was the niece of Harrison's first wife. So he married his children's first cousin, which his children didn't like very much. And they actually kind of cut him out of their life. I don't know what it is with these 19th century presidents marrying family members or odd people like that, but it happens more often than you'd think. This is the bed he died in at his very modest home in Indianapolis. While he was president, very little was accomplished by him. The Congress did spend $1 billion for the first time, which was actually quite unpopular. 6 states were signed into law, becoming states. That's more than any other president, all out there in the West. They started a new program to start building battleships, like the USS Texas. Our very first battleship was commissioned by the president. And the White House was electrified. In fact, Benjamin Harrison and his wife, actually, the electricity was so new, they were actually scared to turn the lights on or off. So they would sit in the dark at the White House until, a servant walked by that they could get to flick the lights on. They did pass some, antitrust legislation. Big business was on the rise. Government was interested in doing some regulation, but there were things like the Homestead strike. This was a giant steel manufacturing strike in 1892. and the president got involved in this giant strike. What did he do? He called out the army to shoot at the strikers and break them up. So kind of disappointing, I suppose, where you fall on that, but probably not a good use of the army to fire on striking workers. Surprise! It's Grover Cleveland. He's back. He gets a second term. His second term, Grover Cleveland actually runs with Adlai Stevenson as his vice president, creating one of the best campaign slogans, or one of my personal favorites, which is "Vote for Cleve and Steve." And this was Cleve and Steve brand bourbon that they handed out with their bottle, their face on the bottle. I would love to get a hold of these, one of these someday. Cleve and Steve, our choice. So here we can see again, this is actually Grover Cleveland actually wins the popular vote 3 times in a row, but that second time he had lost the Electoral College to Benjamin Harrison. So he's back in office. He doesn't want to allow any of that mintage of free silver. There's a huge strike at the Pullman Company in 1894. They make train cars. And now we know what the last president did. This guy's in a different political party, so you'd figure his response would be a little bit different, but he actually calls out the army and has them put down the strike. So that's another reason you see these presidents just kind of not remembered well, is you can kind of replace one with another. They had such similar political views on many topics, like labor relations. During his second term in office, he actually developed a cancer in the mouth. A doctor, checking him out, discovered that he smoked a lot of cigars. He developed a cancer in his upper hard palate, and they wanted to operate, but that was kind of a very scary prospect, and the economy was teetering on the brink of collapse. So Grover Cleveland said, well, I don't want to upset the economy, so let's do it in secret on a boat. And that's what they did. They went on a boat off of Long Island. They removed the cancer, and they had replaced his upper hard palate with a hard piece of rubber. So no one was the wiser. I'm not sure if that would work today. After his term in office, we get William McKinley, who's of course assassinated in 1901, leading to that cowboy Roosevelt being president, both well known. And now we're on to our very last obscure president. This is William Howard Taft. Taft, only obscure president of the 20th century. He said, well, I certainly like possum. I ate very heartily of it last night. It didn't disturb me in the slightest, my digestion or my sleep. And he also said, presidents come and go, but the Supreme Court goes on forever. So that's his wife, Helen. She's very, very small. He's very, very large. And she is the one encouraging him to become the president. He really wants to be a Supreme Court Chief Justice. Just like Martin Van Buren at the very beginning, he rides into office on Teddy Roosevelt's coattails. He is actually made the Governor General of the Philippines, hence the nice white suit when he goes to Manila. When he goes to Manila, he's there under Roosevelt's direction for a number of years. He telegrams President Roosevelt one day, and he says, I went on a horseback ride, explored Manila today. You know, everything seems to be going well here. Roosevelt's response back was, how's the horse? Which is kind of mean, but a little funny. But here you can see this buzz of the Supreme Court buzz in one ear and the call of the president in the other. He really wanted to be Supreme Court Justice. So he wasn't interested in being president. The thing most people know about him is he got stuck in a bathtub, but that's not actually true. He had a giant bathtub installed. It would be next to impossible for any human to get stuck in it. It was big enough for 4 men. He had a huge bathtub. He was the first president to have a presidential automobile. Here he is in a white steam car produced in Cleveland. He's the first president to play golf. He loved playing golf, even though he's a large man. And he was also the last president to keep a cow at the White House, Pauline Wayne. It's the name of the cow. This cow was there for fresh milk. We all know the story of the teddy bear, where President Roosevelt refused to shoot a young bear that had been tied up. And they produced a stuffed animal of the little bear and their beloved childhood feature. A lot of toy makers thought that the teddy bear was so associated with Teddy Roosevelt that it would just be a fad and move on. And in fact, that the next president would have his own stuffed animal, which wound up being called the Billy Possum, far less popular than the teddy bear. When President Taft, when he was president-elect, he actually had dinner down in Atlanta. And in Atlanta, he was served an entire roast possum, which he ate so fast, a doctor nearby had to tell him, sir, please slow down. I'm concerned about medically how fast you're eating this barbecued possum. And he ate the whole thing, which was kind of presented to him half as a joke, and just said, I love it. Now where's the regular dinner? And he ate the entire thing by himself. So he became associated with the possum, the Billy Possum, not as popular as the teddy bear. But he did get his wish. He got put on the Supreme Court. There's a picture of him inaugurating Herbert Hoover. And now the last part of the presentation. I know we've gone a little over an hour, but this is well worth it, I think. I've got two dishonorable mentions. These are people who were vice presidents. They were just a mere heartbeat away from being president, and I think they are dishonorable mentions, I guess. Thomas Marshall. Marshall was the vice president under Woodrow Wilson. He said, once there were two brothers, one ran away to sea, the other was elected vice president. Nothing was ever heard from either of them again. If John Tyler was a great vice president for setting precedent about becoming the president, Marshall does the opposite. So we know originally the vice president was actually the loser of the election, or the runner-up, I should say, whoever came in second place. This was a bad idea because you have political people who hate each other being forced to be president and vice president. They fixed that with an amendment to the Constitution basically right away by 1800. So Marshall here was Woodrow Wilson's vice president. Woodrow Wilson suffers a massive stroke in 1919, right after the end of World War I, while he's still in office. The entire cabinet implores Marshall to step forward and basically say, the president is incapacitated, I need to take over. He didn't do that. The president remained dangerously ill over in Europe, couldn't participate in treaty negotiations to end the war. His wife and his doctor had to try and run the country, and Marshall didn't do anything. In fact, the United States doesn't wind up joining the League of Nations because Marshall refuses to do anything as vice president. So you can also be, not only are all vice presidents by nature obscure, you can be extra obscure. But I want to end, well, we also now know the 25th Amendment does explicitly make it clear that the vice president can seize office if the president is incapacitated in some way. But Richard Mentor Johnson, last guy I want to talk about. We all heard Tippy Canoe and Tyler too. He was not the only War of 1812 hero with a poem. There was also Rumsey Dumpsey, Rumsey Dumpsey, Richard Johnson killed Tecumseh. He was Martin Van Buren's vice president, and he was famous for killing Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. There he is on horseback with Kentucky militia, shooting this native leader, who's kind of the last chance for a free and independent indigenous state in North America. So I think a lot of modern sentiment might not be that this is all that heroic, but he was loved in the 19th century. He was kind of a controversial figure to begin with. He was actually married to one of his slaves. He was from Kentucky, and he took on one of his slaves as his wife and had children who were of mixed heritage. This was a huge scandal in the 1830s and 40s, an affecting scene in Kentucky. We can see when I read the scurriest attacks in the newspaper on the mother of my children, pardon me, my friends, if I give way to feelings. My dear girls, bring me your mother's picture. I may show it to my friends here. This very complicated political cartoon, but that's a very sad looking Richard Mentor Johnson, that this kind of news is being spread that he's married to a woman that he owns, and it's obviously a black woman. And he said, well, plenty of these other politicians also basically have mistresses and are having sexual relations with their slaves, but I'm just open about it. At least I admit it. It's not looking good for him as vice president. Perhaps even more so, he knows John Cleve Sims Jr., who is famous for believing that the earth is hollow and habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other, so it's open at the poles at 12 or 16 degrees. And I pledge my life in support of this truth, and I'm ready to explore the hollow if the world will support me and aid me in the undertaking. So there's a crazy man who thinks the earth is hollow, and our vice president is behind him 100% and wants to send expeditions to explore the hollow earth. As kind of depicted here with these concentric, smaller, hollow Earths inside the Earth that you could get to through the North Pole. Interesting viewpoint. He kept trying to get the Senate to try and send out these expeditions. It just never worked. Here we have pictures of that, Panic of 1837, a bunch of sad people. You don't need to read everything here to know that these people are poor, sad, no one knows what to do. And, when you've got one of these economic depressions like this, you really want your vice president to be there for you. But unfortunately for Martin Van Buren, Richard Mentor Johnson actually returns home to Kentucky. And what's supposed to be just kind of a week-long visit home for him to check on his economic affairs, but actually turns to a 9-month stay, where Richard Mentor Johnson opens a bar. this is inconceivable today that the vice president, the sitting vice president, would leave office, return to Kentucky, and just open a tavern in their home state because it pays better than being vice president. And finally, somebody was sent to look in on him, and they said that Richard Mentor Johnson was, quote, happy in the inglorious pursuit of tavern keeping, given his personal superintendence to the chicken and egg purchasing and watermelon selling department. So pretty wild to think about. But hey, this is actually a picture from the U.S. Capitol frieze. So this is inscribed in marble on the U.S. Capitol for as long as it's there. And it's a scene right from the War of 1812, right in the middle. That's Richard Mentor Johnson shooting Tecumseh. I don't know what that says about American history, that again, you can be an insane person who shirks your duty and believes the earth is hollow, but as long as you killed an indigenous leader, you're a great hero and will wind up on the Capitol dome. Likewise with all of the presidents, no matter how obscure you are, how little you accomplished in office, you can always rest assured you will still wind up with a spot in the Hall of Presidents. So that's something. So there we have it. There is, 46 presidents. We've looked at the obscure ones. Presidents are something, again, I love talking about, but these are some of the other lectures, some of which I have done right here in Livonia, others I have not. I know if you found this interesting, you might find some of the others interesting. You can always put in a request with your friendly local librarian, who I'm always happy to come back, either on Zoom or in person.